Are you in touch with Jeff?
He's telling me
We're waiting on him.
Hello. There, can you hear me?
Just a little. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Welcome to our session about Murdoch. I'm sorry that I'm the giant head in the sky. I'm an old man who's neurotic about the germs, so I'm still in New York. I'm grateful for you being here. I wish I were there in Perugia with you. And I'm grateful to my fellow panelists here for this discussion. The idea here is to ask what we in journalism should do about the problem of Murdoch. Now that presumes that Murdoch is a problem. I believe he is. I think we agree about that. And so I thought we'd start with first quick introductions of who we are, and then some bills of indictment against Murdoch and News Corp. What is the problem of him? And then ask that we as journalists, as a field, should be doing. What should we be expected to police our own? And then discussion with the room. So let's start with our own introductions. Kathy, you want to start us off?
Sure. Hi, thank you. Jeff, I always think of you as larger than life, and now you truly are. Hi, my name's Kathy English. I am VP of Content Integrity and Editorial Standards for a New York-based publishing company called Dotdash Meredith. I am a Canadian, and I'm also chair of the board of the Canadian Journalism Foundation.
Hey everybody, I'm Kyle Pope, editor and publisher of the Columbia Journalism Review.
So I'm James Ball. I'm global editor at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and a trustee of the Ethical Journalism Network, both of which I mention mostly to say these are my opinions in the next hour and not theirs.
Plug your book as well, James.
Oh yes, I'm also the author of Post-Truth, How Bullshit Conquered the World, which may have some relevance to why I'm sat here.
Yes.
And I'm Jeff Jarvis from the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. Full disclosure is I once worked for Murdoch. I was the TV critic at TV Guide back in the day, so I'm trying to make up for my sins ever since. Quickly, my perspective on the sins of Murdoch. I think that there's little doubt that he does damage to democracy around the world. In the US, we have Fox News. I've watched my own father be brainwashed by Fox. Interestingly, when my father's hearing aid broke and he got breakthrough COVID and wasn't exposed to Fox for a while, he regained his self and now says nice things about Joe Biden. I think we've seen the impact in America of the election of Donald Trump. We now have Tucker Carlson, who is as much as supporting Putin on the air. And so in the US, we can list many sins. In the UK, I think we see Murdoch's impact on Brexit and on the phone hacking scandal. There's a story today out that how many millions they've spent as a result of that. In Australia, he has a virtual monopoly in Victoria, I believe it is, and uses his clout, that is to say the politicians in his pocket, to arrange baksheesh, in my view, that is to say payments from the platforms to news organizations. And we can debate about the merits of that. I've said for a long time that Murdoch is the most malign influence in English-speaking democracy. There's a new book coming out where Joe Biden said that he is the most dangerous man in the world, beating even my opinion. And so I think it's important for us to look at the impact of Murdoch's media on democracy in this time of abundant misinformation. A lot of attention goes to the platforms, as it should, and to the public conversation, as we must. but we really have to look at media's role in the misinformation ecosystem and Murdoch's keystone role in that. Things may start online, they may start in the crazy edges, but it's Murdoch and Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity and Fox News that amplify it. And we have Murdoch now planning to start another news channel in the UK. And he has huge influence in Australia, where Sky News, the brand he still owns there, goes even past Fox News. So let's start there with the Bill of Attainder with Murdoch. What are your perspectives? James, you want to start?
Yeah, and I suspect, this could end up being the most pro-Murdoch set of comments I ever readers. Murdoch's papers want the connection, want the relevance, want the audience, and so they go where the readers are. Murdoch spots where the wind is blowing and tries to move slightly ahead of time. I do not think Murdoch swung the 92 election for the Tories, the 97 one for Labour, or the 2010 one for the Conservatives. I think he split his newspapers on Brexit, which sort of let him claim victory either way. You're now at a very strange part of Murdoch's legacy where he doesn't have the bigger business anymore. The studios are gone. Sky is gone. He's sort of got the core bits of the empire that he really cared about, the newspapers, which were always his first love and still are. He's got Fox News, which may be abhorrent, but it's the most powerful sort of thing there. And he's got HarperCollins. The Sunday Times is doing some of the best investigative journalism in the UK right now, and some of the stuff that's most difficult for the government. Sky News in the UK is a brilliant broadcasting channel. The Sun is not the malign force it once was. So you've got a complicated picture in the UK, but the thing that overshadows all of that is part of why the Sun behaves so well now is because of phone hacking. It is 15 years since phone hacking was revealed. Sorry, I am wrapping, I promise. And the initial responses were to try and say this was one reporter at the News of the World. And then they tried to say it was only the News of the World, even though it was everywhere. They have then spent the last 10 years settling every single phone hacking claim made against the Sun before it can go into court, often paying huge sums. And anecdotally, some people where there is very good evidence they weren't hacked get offered a small sum of money, costs, to go away quietly, rather than face what they usually would. Now that means Murdoch has spent 50 million in the last 12 months, 80 million in the 12 months before that, and coming towards $1 billion on claiming that the Sun never hacked phones. Now, I can't think of more than one reason why you would spend nearly $1 billion to not have to ever say either way whether the Sun hacked phones. But let us not forget, one of the editors went on to be Cameron's director of communications, and then was found guilty. The other is still the chief exec of News Group UK. So these people are still there, the money is still being spent, the bad deeds were done. But as Murdoch now is looking to legacy rather than to acquisition, growth, power, leveraging his newspapers for his Sky network, I think it's very complicated to say what he's going to do next. I have some thoughts on that for later.
Thank you. Kyle?
I also have, I guess, a half disclosure. I worked for 10 years at the Wall Street Journal before Murdoch bought it, so I got out. In the U.S., to me, this story is really about Fox, and sort of to your point, what we see as Fox now it didn't look quite like that in 2015 when Trump declared that he was running for office. In fact, Murdoch was critical of Trump, and it wasn't clear sort of what direction he was going to go. And there were other players that were more dominant in the sort of pro-Trump media movement, Breitbart being the primary one. And then what happened over the ensuing term was that the Breitbarts of the world faded, and Fox rose, and Murdoch's embrace of Trump and all that Trump represented gathered steam. It's one thing to say that Fox sort of led the Trump charge, but when you really delve into it, it was even more fundamental than we than we initially recognized. We published at CJR a terrific analysis by a Harvard researcher named Yochai Benkler, who looked at the grouping of different sentiments of journalism, and I think he looked at 1.25 million stories and tried to track like the pro-Trump media and the the Democratic, for lack of a better word, media. And what he found was that there was a lot more cohesion on the right in terms of the press. The messaging was very compact, and the grouping was very tight, whereas on the left, it was much more spread out. There were a lot more voices. They often disagreed. There was internal disagreement there. So there was a real cohesion and then there were competitors to Fox, other networks that started to grow up that have all since gone away. So you have this very cohesive, almost monolithic right-wing messaging that is now all centered around one outlet, which is really unusual. In the US, if you look at the left, it's sort of all over the map. I mean, there's actually a split amongst the left in the US in the media. There was a lot of left-wing media that didn't like Biden, and it's messy. It's complete dominance on the right. So that has given Fox extraordinary power. Fox is by far the most viewed network in the United States. And it'll be interesting to see, I mean, you have seen a few, some dissent amongst the staff. You've had a few relatively high-profile departures from Fox in the last year or so, where people have left, and they've said, and I think it's quite disingenuous, they were like, well, this is outrageous what Fox is doing, I'm out, after having been there for decades. But they do it. One person went to CNN. But I mean, there's little signs of dissent. But and this is a sort of broader point. But I mean, I think whatever the last 6 years look like in terms of the role, the centrality of the press in American politics, often in a negative way, where people are just obsessed and the focus of anger is on the media. I think we're heading into an election cycle where that is going to be much worse. I think the threats against journalists, the accusations that journalists are biased, the sort of the complete siloing of viewers and readers, I think is going to be even more intense as we head into the midterms and then on to the presidential election. And Fox is going to be at the middle of it.
Okay,
Kathy.
Thank you. Well, being in Canada, it would be nice to say that we are immune from the Fox News effect, but we're not. Canada and the U.S. share one of the world's largest undefended borders, which is a lovely thing, but it's the cultural border that's most important between Canada and the U.S., and U.S. culture is, for the most part, unfortunately, often Canadian culture. So the Fox News effect, we've seen it particularly since 2015. Like Jeff, my own father watched Fox News obsessively, and his daughter, who'd worked in newspapers for years, has said to him, like, there's no way that guy can win. Every U.S. newspaper has come out editorially against him. He's going, he's going to win, Kathy, he's going to win. And I was the public editor of the Toronto Star at that point. I ended up writing a column about the media soul searching, about, what did we, where did we miss this? And, sort of said, maybe I should have listened to my dad. And recently, we've had a truckers' convoy in Canada that has been cheered on by Tucker Carlson. So this whole destabilizing of democracy, the politicization of the very idea of truth, is just being imported into Canada in a way that's really frightening to many of us. And we don't have the same right-wing media machine. We've got some, I characterize them as fringe, and that may be a bit naive on my part, but some outlets that reflect that point of view, but it's really the fact that Fox is carried, by all our cable companies, and people subscribe to it, so we're not immune.
Is Fox a problem for journalism?
I mean, to me, it seems like it risks the safety of other journalists. And what I worry about now is what would sort of cause a real moment of soul searching for those left there. You know, they come very, very close to inciting violence against other journalists. We came very, very close in the 2016 election cycle and the 2020 election cycle to, you know, serious violence rather than sort of nonsense. And everything feels angrier and darker. The mainstream view, the supposedly mainstream major, you know, largest cable news outlet often beats network ratings of Fox. You know, I'm just finishing a book on QAnon, and Fox News often sounds like QAnon these days. And that is moving, that cannot help but stir people towards violence. And, you know, I hope to be being alarmist here. Information way, I think Fox News is dangerous to journalists.
Yeah.
Kyle, you, and I was glad to be there at the beginning, you hired ombudsman, external ombudsman, independent ombudsman for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN. But
And
you didn't
MSNBC.
for Fox.
MSNBC.
And MSNBC, thank you. But not Fox.
Yeah.
I'm curious why.
Several reasons. Well, can I just, before I answer that, just pick up
Please.
on something that James said about danger. The thing that that needs to be added is the role that Fox played on the January 6th attack on the Capitol in the U.S., which was direct, and not only on that day, but in the weeks and months between the election and then when they really went full on into this idea that was completely unsupported by any facts that the election had been stolen, and that fed everything that happened on January 6th, where you had, you know, people die. So this is just, when we're talking about danger, this is real. On our public editors, what we did was, well, for those of you who didn't follow it, we were annoyed that news outlets got rid of their public editors. Kathy was in that role in Toronto, and a lot of these outlets used to have people, and they got rid of them. The New York Times, for instance, said, we're going to get rid of our public editor and let Twitter be our public editor, which we thought was a ridiculous idea. So in a kind,
Now they've left Twitter.
and now they're telling the reporters you got to get off Twitter, which was totally predictable. Anyway, so in a sort of cheeky move, we said, well, we're going to name our own public editors, and we're going to call them the public editor for MSNBC and CNN and the Times and the Washington Post, which none of them liked. They thought it was like obnoxious that we did that, but we had people writing these stories. To Jeff's question, we didn't name one for Fox for a few reasons. One, we thought that and this is a discussion that we can have now, we thought that a lot of what we would write about Fox, a lot of other people were writing. And they were sort of making these points over and over again, and we weren't sure that we had enough to add to that conversation on a regular basis. Two, I came to believe over time that, especially in primetime, Fox really wasn't a journalistic organization. It was, and they have this kind of crazy thing, and they get furious every time we say that, when we say that their opinion, and they'll say, well, that's not true because during the day we have regular reporting and then at night it becomes something else, and I'm like, how does anybody know this? Like, do you put up a sign that says, okay, well, we're now going to go into op-ed land at 8 o'clock at night or something? And frankly, MSNBC does the same thing, to be honest.
So does CNN.
And CNN. And in fact, when we're talking about dangers of Fox, I think one of the dangers is that they've sort of offered an enticement to those other networks to follow a similar path. Anyway, so we chose them. We didn't focus a public editor on them because we thought a lot of people were already saying these things, and we didn't have, there often wasn't a journalistic critique. I mean, how do you critique Tucker Carlson going on the air and screaming nonsense? And he does it every single night. And then there was, that was sort of the fundamental idea.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question of you, Kyle? First,
Yep.
sorry for the delay here. This is awkward as hell, and I apologize. Kathy, I want you to lead in the next part.
Sure.
But you said that everybody else writes about Fox. Do we cover Fox enough?
Well-
And further disclosure, I've been on MSNBC's air and begged them to create a segment called "We Watch Fox News So You Don't Have to." So they haven't, and they won't. So I've used some funds that I have, and I'm paying a graduate of our school, Julia Jeske, to do just that, to watch Fox and to try to understand what is it our grandfathers are seeing versus what the world is seeing. So
Yeah.
I'm curious about the quantity and quality of media's coverage of media's own when it comes to Fox. What's your analysis of that?
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, just because we didn't appoint one of these public editors to Fox doesn't mean we haven't been covering what Fox does. We write a lot about Fox. In fact, there's a columnist, Jeff, you probably know, Howard Polskin, who really looks at right-wing media, and we run pieces by him, and we report a lot on what Fox does. Gosh, I lost the thread here.
Does the rest of media, do
Sorry?
we cover Fox as the political actor it is in our coverage?
I think there's a decent amount of this coverage. I think Eric Wimple at the Washington Post does an amazing amount of reporting on Fox. Margaret Sullivan at the Washington Post, the Times. I mean, the New York Times did a sort of brilliant magazine piece that was, I don't know, thousands and thousands of words about it. So Brian Stelter at CNN has written an entire book about it. I'm sorry, what?
Gabe.
Yeah. Gabe Sherman at Vanity Fair. So there's, and as well as a book. So there's a lot out there. It doesn't mean that we're not covering this as an ongoing operation. But it's, it's something that we really have to think through, like how do we bring, and by the way, this idea that like we're going to hire somebody to watch what our fathers watch, we're watching stuff that the majority of American viewers at any one time are watching. This is not a niche audience. This is not a small audience of fringe people. This is a place that's getting huge audience numbers, and so we dismiss it at our peril. We have to know what's happening, and so I think that's something to talk about when we get to the next discussion here about what do we do, because I think ignoring it or putting it in a very small box doesn't really work.
Kathy, please respond to all of that, but then I want to ask you to start us on the next segment.
Okay.
And explore what our journalistic, professional, ethical responsibilities are regarding bad actors in our field.
Sure. Okay, well, I think the common theme here is that the whole Murdoch empire, whether that's the newspapers in Britain, Australia, or Fox News, and it's to a lesser extent, it's newspapers in the US, it's all about power without responsibility, power without accountability in any way. And accountability, journalistic accountability, first of all, assumes that you have some journalistic standards that someone's going to hold you accountable for. I don't know. I have never seen whether Fox News has a journalistic standards guide. Do they have standards? I don't know. But I think also Kyle really touched on the audience issue, that the audience doesn't understand the distinction between fact-based journalism, reporting, and talking heads who are spewing their opinions night after night after night. As the public editor of The Star, I would talk to a lot of readers about their complaints, their concerns, and what really came to the forefront is that the public just has so little understanding of what we do as journalists, and what is opinion journalism, what is a commentator. They just put it all in that bucket called journalism or news, and don't understand that. So, I believe I liked what Kyle did, because in the U.S. the move to let go of any kind of journalistic accountability between 2008 and 2015-16, any kind of news ombudsman, public editor role had been dropped. So this sense of holding a newsroom to account, I think, is quite important. And I may be one of the few Canadians who read every word of the Levinson inquiry because I was fascinated by how accountability had fallen so short in Britain with the phone hacking scandal. And, I would watch the hearings to the extent I could, but reading the report after, it was like, it was total impunity in terms of lack of accountability. So that's what I'd like to bring this to, is talking about accountability.
So how would we do that?
Well, there are ways to be accountable. You can have a public editor and news ombudsman. You can certainly have journalistic standards that your editor is going to hold your newsroom to account for. You can have, we have press councils in Canada, media columnists. All of those elements help the public understand journalism, but really hold newsrooms to account. I mean, as public editor for 13 years, I had some really awful journalistic ethical breaches I had to deal with. Plagiarism cases where I had to call out journalists, for plagiarism. Stories about, or columns about how journalists fell short of the kind of standards that our audiences should expect from us. So that's a form of accountability.
Jay, but that's talking about internal devices of accountability. James, in the UK, the only accountability that came to Murdoch obviously was external, especially in phone hacking and The Guardian.
Yeah.
What's the responsibility? And you have press councils that are regularly held up on the flagpole and then regularly don't work. That nice, lovely regulatory reflex in the UK.
Well,
what's our obligation as a field external to Murdoch?
we don't have Fox News in the UK, and while Sky in Australia puts out some really dreadful material, Sky News in the UK is genuinely a brilliant rolling
He doesn't
channel.
own that anymore, right?
That's because we have regulation. And press regulation in the UK is a bit tricky, I'll get onto it. But what I find interesting is I often talk to Americans, and they absolutely blanch in horror at the idea of the editorial codes and regulations we have in the UK, whereas most journalists in the UK actually quite like the system. And our rule is, if you're on broadcast, if you're being given air, you have a high standard to meet, and that is state regulation. It's quite independent. There's a couple of issues with the current new chair who's come in, who is, though, an experienced broadcaster who's worked there, even if he's known to be sympathetic to the government. The impartiality codes on Ofcom let you put out good investigative stuff, but they require you to be actually balanced, and they give an outside accountability mechanism. It's not really about fines, it's that, although you can be, it's usually more about having to post corrections, having to post inquiries, sort of do that kind of thing. The press is much less regulated, as it should be. You need somewhere where the government can't withdraw a license to do journalism. But there are voluntary councils. IPSO is the biggest one, and it can require a publisher to post a correction in a certain page, in a certain font size, and if they don't comply, they're out. We also, of course, have privacy laws, have defamation, have all of that. I would say I don't think IPSO is perfect. The Guardian didn't join it when it had done it, but The Guardian also didn't endorse Levison's plan for a state-backed regulator, which, I was on the investigations desk of The Guardian at the time, and pretty much all of us supported The Guardian's decision there because we felt like it would interfere with independent investigative journalism. So actually, good self-regulation and thinking about treating broadcast differently from online and print is important. Print journalism, buying an actual paper, going to an actual journalism website, requires conscious choice. TV journalism is so much easier to come across passively and so carries higher risks. The US, with its neutral papers and biased broadcast, I think, unfortunately, has things the wrong way around, and so is polarized, harder and faster than the rest of us. So I think good regulation and a little bit more willingness for dog to eat dog. Far too many journalists hate accountability, hate being called out on Twitter, and sometimes confuse that with the very different debate that is harassment and abuse. It is not abuse for someone to point out you framed a story wrong, even if they're rude about it.
And James, I'll just point out that The Guardian didn't join Ipsos, but they do have a reader's editor.
They didn't join Ipso.
No, but they do. But The
they-
Guardian has a reader's editor.
They've got their own independent. The FT did the same thing
Yes.
as well, not joining any of them, and the Independent does something similar too.
Let's just mention, I believe that Murdoch does not any longer own a stake in Sky News UK.
No, that got passed over when during the big sale. But to be honest, it's operating much the same. And actually, they had to give guarantees on its future operation for either 10 or 15 years. Please, if someone's looking at the guarantees on how Sky News will be funded, look them up, because I haven't. But I think it's 10 or 15 years funded at the equivalent of the current level, which I think was a good guarantee for regulators to ask for. It is a good part of the UK ecosystem.
Kyle?
You know, in the debate about external versus internal controls, there's, you know, the political business regulatory climate in the U.S. is such that I don't think there's ever going to be anything like what you're talking about in the UK and the U.S. I just don't. It's a completely deregulated business world in general. And especially as it relates to media, I mean, look how hard it's been for anybody to do anything about Facebook in the U.S. I just don't see it. Jeff, maybe you have ideas on what that would look like, but I haven't seen anything that I think is going to stick. I think the answer is, I mean, to me, the answer, and of course this is where I would come from, running a journalism review, is reporting. I mean, I can tell you that, for instance, when you know, Sean Hannity, who's the marquee anchor at Fox, and Trump were sort of joined at the hip, and I mean, they were having regular phone conversations. Trump was consulting with Hannity on what he should say and when. Hannity would give him feedback on what he did, and it was an embarrassment to a lot of the journalists at Fox, and they were not happy about it. And you know, I think reporting those stories and reporting what the sentiments are, because the reporting troops at Fox are not monolithic. I mean, you saw, you know, at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I mean, Fox took this sort of pro-Russian stance, which was sort of you know, jaw-dropping. At the same time they were doing that, they had incredibly courageous correspondents covering that war, including a camera person who died. So, you know, it's complicated, and it's not one unit. I mean, I think what I'm really interested, especially going into this next cycle, is, you know, really reporting more inside Fox, as opposed to just watching television and being outraged about what is said.
So we should just quickly flag Fox's local fixer was killed in the same attack as well.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Should Fox have a seat in White House press conferences? Should the White House, I mean, if you say that it's not a journalistic organization, does that imply that journalism should expel the germ from the bloodstream? Just as one example.
If you're asking me that, I mean, I don't understand the value of the White House press room in general. But you know, when Trump was there, O&O was there, which is this even more right-wing outlet. I think Gateway Pundit was there. Yeah. I think so. It was like it was a circus. But I don't know. I mean, I think the value of that transaction, I really question.
I would also say that since 2016, there's been a whole lot of initiatives to try and establish standards around what is trustworthy journalism, whether that's the Trust Project, the Journalism Trust Initiative, NewsGuard. I don't think any of us have really been able to figure out if they're effective or not, but there has been at least that effort to sort of say, you know, what is trustworthy journalism? Well, you know, it's accurate, it does corrections, it's aims to be fair, and you know that's a loaded word in itself, but that is another mechanism, at least, of self-regulation. And I know in Canada, the only time self-regulation has ever come about with press councils is when the government was threatened to step in. We've had a couple of you know, since the 1970s, a couple of major government commissions on the state of the media, and each time it was the industry itself that jumped in to self-regulate, create press councils, create news ombudsmen and public editors, so that just to keep the government away.
I want to mention or plug a book that I just finished reading called The Newspaper Axis by Catherine Olmstead, which is about the the 6 press barons who enabled Hitler in the subtitle. Rothermere and Beaverbrook in the UK, Hearst, McCormick, Patterson in the US. And I think it illuminates the discussion to look back. Of course, that was a time when the popular press was right-wing, when FDR went on radio because he couldn't get a fair hearing in his belief in the press. I wonder whether there are any lessons for us from any of our countries in the past with other actors in journalism who are now gone. How did that happen? How did we, you know, kind of get rid of that malign influence?
So I sort of have one lesson from the past, but it may not quite be the one that you're thinking of there, in that I think some people and some publishers who would otherwise have sort of legacies maybe not much better than the 6 in those books, certainly when I think of Rothermere, as of then not the current Lord Rothermere, or Beaverbrook, we tend not to think in the same breath of Joseph Pulitzer. And that's because he endowed the prize. And so over the time, the man who created and enabled yellow journalism, and some really genuinely look at the papers that Joseph Pulitzer made, we do not associate with that. We associate it with the very best of journalism, literacy, arts. Look at Alfred Nobel, who swapped out, TNT. Perhaps more controversially, look at someone like C.P. Scott, who is regarded as the greatest editor The Guardian ever had, but he also was its owner for the entire time. If you ever believed in some kind of division between commercial and that, it's sort of very easy when you're the editor and the owner to say that, of course, the right things lead. But Scott is particularly remembered by those in the British media because it turned out his tax legacy was quite complicated, and so it made sense for him to turn it into a trust. And The Guardian is owned by no one and endowed to be able to do independent journalism. And when I look at Murdoch launching radio stations and launching TV stations, that looks to me like a man who's thinking of his legacy. And does he want his legacy to be the division of Fox News? I doubt. He's sold off most of his empire. His children have their multi-billion inheritance each. He could quite easily spin off his newspapers, including The Sun if he wished, including TLS if he wished, and form the Murdoch Trust. There is no reason he couldn't look to the press barons of the past who fixed their names and actually give the UK 3 new, very independent, very well-funded newspapers. Now, would that change his name in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years? No, we're going to remember he did Fox. But in 100 years, might people talk about Murdoch like we talk about Pulitzer now? I wonder if one of the people who could do something about Murdoch's legacy would be Murdoch. Would it absolve the harms of Fox, of The Sun in the 80s, of phone hacking? No, but that's not how history works.
Can I just ask, another form of accountability is your audience. Like, why is Fox News the most watched network? Like, there are some newspaper proprietors who rejected accountability based on, we're popular, that's all the accountability I need. They're buying us, they're watching us. Why Fox News? Why is it so popular?
Well, partly I think it has to do with what I was talking about what are the alternatives? I mean, are they splitting the audience with anybody? And right now they're not.
Okay.
But I think it spoke to, and by the way, they did sort of adapt their message after the rise of Trump. I mean, they really bought into the sort of anti-establishment, anti-elite sort of messaging. So, I mean, I think you can ask the same question about, like, why did Trump get elected? You know what I mean? I mean, or why is there this wave around the world? So I think they definitely tapped into it. I mean, to James's point, I mean, Murdoch did almost die. When was that? 10 or so years ago on his yacht where he fell, and in fact, his family thought that he wasn't going to make it, and they brought in people around, and it's just sort of to say their last goodbyes and whatever. And that could have been the moment where he could have said, okay, I've seen the end, and I need to sort of change my ways. It didn't happen. In fact, it accelerated this move of his. So I get what you say about people start to get nervous about their legacy, but I don't think there's any sign of that with him.
Well, Lachlan, his son, by many accounts, is more extreme than his father. Though one speculation has it that when Murdoch does go, James and other children may have enough ownership that they can shift the yacht to a different direction. I don't know. And Kathy,
James is an interesting figure, Jeff, in that he's
Yes.
sort of seen as the nice Murdoch now. You know, he's publicly renounced the family. He was the chief exec of News UK when most of the phone hacking happened.
Yes.
And so he is at best the rehabilitated Murdoch. Just to sort of flag that.
I agree. I didn't mean for this to be so America-centric, but given Fox News, it kind of inevitably is. Kyle, you brought up the next election. Our friend Jay Rosen often asks whether we've learned any lessons. Margaret Sullivan does too. I think we haven't, but if in the short time toward the elections, midterm and presidential, is there anything that we can do to blunt the impact of Fox News in that election? And Kathy, one response to you is, Kyle said it before, I think the concentration, where basically now, unlike the days of the press barons, much of media was conservative. Now in America, from Dan Okrent on, let's admit that most media in America are liberal. So Fox is the one exception. And a Gallup poll says that it is the most trusted news outlet in the US because it's the only conservative one, and everybody else splits the vote. So we have this terribly powerful entity. And we have other media, I think, somewhat falling over themselves. The New York Times trying to prove it's not liberal and be contrarian regularly. What would a strategy be to counteract not just social media, but especially Fox in the election?
I don't think I
Anybody?
have the answer to that one. I actually feel quite pessimistic about that even all the liberal voices in the world, all the fact-based reporting is not going to sway that audience. And that, I know that's a very negative view, but, and I'm not in the US, so Kyle, I think you have to try to answer that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only way I know how to do it is, I mean, well, there is the thing that we haven't talked about, which is the Fox audience swayable? Is it possible through reporting to convince viewers of Fox that they should, in fact, if they want to get a real view of what's going on, watch something else? It right now is a very, very hardened divide, and there's not a lot of openness to that from polls that we've seen. But, it's something, and, Jeff mentioned the Times, which I think, is sort of tries to be a little broader. But, by becoming, I'm not sure that by becoming more partisan at MSNBC and CNN, that's going to lure Fox people over. Again, not to repeat myself, but the only answer I have is through reporting that shows how the world is different than what Fox is portraying. And the truth is that once in a while, when you really delve into a specific story, Fox viewers say something surprising, which is that often, or not often, but occasionally, they realize that what they are getting, especially in prime time, isn't always necessarily true, but it's entertaining, it's entertainment, and it's interesting, and it's provocative. So it's a slightly different battle that you're waging than everybody else is fighting.
I think we have a bad habit of not acknowledging two really obvious things. One is that there is a massive collection of groupthink among all the other outlets, and it's very easy to paint them all as fairly monolithic because there is a large liberal consensus, and it does look quite smug, and it does look quite elite, and it does look quite alienating. And, let's fight each other a bit more and not quite look like that. I think the other is we keep on sort of going, and this sort of sounds aimed at you and it isn't intended to be, if we just report a bit harder, if we just carry on doing what we're doing, but do it a bit better this time and a bit more aware, this time it'll work. And, it's sort of reminds me of someone, sort of cooking unseasoned vegetables and going, this time the kids will eat them, and serving them up the same dish every time and hoping for a different result. And I do wish that we would try some different things a little more. I don't think that means going hyper-partisan, but, maybe it does start with thinking, how do we start where people are rather than where we wish them to be? How do we get over that desperate liberal need for someone to turn and go, you know what, you were right. If we could get over that instinct, we might do better. Start with where people are and how can they move to a different path. Find people who've moved on that path and hire them. Get newsrooms where it wouldn't sound awful to say you'd voted for Donald Trump. You need some people who actually think like that to do it. I've worked in a news organization where if anyone voted for Brexit, they would never have admitted it. That's not good when 52% of the people in the country did. And so we need some of that. But also, we sort of need to think, well, if we don't think we can beat that, or, the head-on thing, and there's all sorts of things. George Lakoff, who's sort of sociologist who came up with the concept of framing, sort of stresses the more that you start fact-checking certain narratives, the more you reinforce them. Think about immigration and illegal immigrants and the border fence. The more you start fact-checking that, the more strongly you associate immigration with security. Why aren't you telling stories about immigration and cultural mixing? Why aren't you telling stories about immigration and economy? Why, by constantly refuting and rebutting, you keep the security framing so that that's where we think. If we're so good at telling stories, if there's so many more outlets, if there's so much better resource and they're true, why can't we make stories as lively and entertaining and stop just constantly talking about the stories that Fox is telling? If we can't beat it by reporting, why don't we do less on its framings and more of our own fact-based, true, entertaining stories? So, I don't think there's one thing to try. I think we have to try lots of things, but not just what we keep on doing, but a bit harder.
Yeah, no, I actually agree with everything you said. Remember after the first election, 2016, I wrote something talking about enough with all the inside politics reporting, enough with all the sort of personality-based reporting, enough with all the dependence on polling. Let's tell the stories in a more interesting and innovative way. And I remember thinking sort of halfway through the Trump era that what was happening in the country was not what I was reading. Like, there was a gut feel that something else was happening and it wasn't on the page or it wasn't on the screen. And there was a failure of storytelling. Now, I'm not saying that Fox does that, but the stuff, a lot of the rest of the media wasn't doing it in a way that engaged people. Interestingly, I think COVID was a corrective. I mean, I think a lot of the coverage, and I think it's something that I'm really interested in the coverage of the climate crisis, because we have a project at CJR where we really try to lift up climate reporting. And the way that news outlets covered COVID is a great model to think about, because here was a case where you had one story that everybody in the newsroom wrote about. They really wrote about it in a way that how it affected people's lives. They wrote about it in a very kind of straightforward, like, here's the information you need right now that's really critical. Like, you need to know, like, what is the rate in your community. You need to know how to get tested. You need to know how it's affecting underserved communities. And it was powerful. And I think there's maybe there's definitely models, and it's centered science and facts. There is definitely, it's a model for how to think about climate coverage, but I think it may also be a model for how to think about political coverage to get us out of this kind of like beltway mentality that's been so toxic.
I'll add one thing, if I may, that I think that we also have to know what is being watched. What is it that people are seeing in that world? Because I can't bear to watch too much. I should plug the graduate I hired, Julia Geske, at Decoding Fox News, which is the title on both Twitter and on Substack. I think we need to have a better sense of what much of America is hearing, so we can figure out how to follow strategies like James's and avoid falling into the framing and the prioritization that is set by Fox News and such. Should we go to the room? Kathy, go ahead.
No, I just want to say also that I've been in a lot of rooms like this over the last 10 years where we've been talking about this issue in some form or another, and we're preaching to the converted. I mean, how do we not make this just a journalism discussion? How is this a discussion with people in those communities? How do we understand what matters to people in communities and the stories that we're not telling?
Kyle, I can't see the room. Would you mind pointing to anybody who wants to ask a question?
If you could just raise your hand and ask your question, I'll repeat it so everybody else can hear it. Go ahead. James, could you summarize the question?
Yeah, it's essentially about a series of reports in the Times in 2017 that suggested social workers had taken a Christian child and put her in a very, very strict Muslim family, and they'd taken her gold necklace from her mother, and they'd sort of done all sorts of terrible things. I don't think this is a Murdoch danger. I think this is a danger of star reporters. This was one very, very well-respected investigative journalist who had broken some very good, true stories, and who had become convinced by someone very close to this parent, someone within the council, who clearly had an agenda that I believe was an anti-Muslim agenda, and just believed the claims of this woman whose child had been taken into care. One of the first rules on reporting on children who are in care is don't take the parent's word. This didn't follow that very basic it was a bad piece of journalism that fueled Islamophobia, I completely agree. But it was because the reporter was so well respected and had got so many challenging stories right that his sort of questions that should have been asked in the newsroom, I think, weren't. The system worked to an extent in that they had to publish extensive corrections, very much against the will of the reporter and some of the editors, that were then covered by other media. And there was sort of widespread coverage, including how could this have happened type things, because there were fundamental errors. You know, I think this is a case of a reminder that good papers do bad stories sometimes. And it ties into prejudices within the newsroom, lack of diversity there, but also lack of checks and safeguards. And it's the stars that you have to watch for sometimes. I'm sorry if that's not a satisfying answer, but yeah.
Yes.
A question way in the back.
The question's essentially about anti-slap laws, which, given the US has some, I don't know about Canada,
Yeah,
I may
it's
ask
becoming a
others to
thing.
talk about. We're very keen for anti-slap laws in the UK, and the context that Jessica from Index on Censorship, who asked the question, was asking was HarperCollins, which is Murdoch-owned, has spent several million defending books about oligarchs, very well-timed defense, really, but they've been doing this for years. They spent several million defending books that were being pursued by oligarchs in lawsuits that were very widely viewed as being about deterring others from writing about this kind of thing. And, you know, does that move the balance card in Murdoch's favour at all? Not quite sure. But I think there's an interesting issue on slaps there.
I don't know enough about them, but I think it's, you know, it's clear that there's probably some things that the Murdochs are doing that is not totally evil.
Jeff, do you want to pick up on the slap discussion?
Not really. I'm glad that Jessica brought it up. She DM'd me as well. I think that fits in the larger point that James brought up as we come to the end here, that James brought up at the beginning about the worry of violence and danger to journalists. That when we have and not to make this about us, it's really about democracy, but I think that is one of the attacks on journalism that are motivated from within, if you consider Fox within, is one of the risks and dangers we have to look at. I think we're out of time. I want to thank you all for doing this, for tolerating the big giant head and the communications that exist. And I'm jealous that you're all in Perugia and have some cacio e pepe for me. And if you want to say anything last to close up, I pass it over to you.
So just to thank you as well, Jeff, and also say I would love a UK slap law, so anyone who can help us with that, please do.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.